So welcome to our philosophical community, the White Tower. We're very pleased. We'd like to express our gratitude to our chief guest today, Dr. Daniel Dal Monte, for joining us and accepting our invitation. Delighted to have you with us, Dr. Dal Monte.
It's my pleasure, and I enjoy the work you're doing, Dimitrios.
Thank you very much. Dr. Daniel Dal Monte is the author of 2 books. He is an author of a newly produced textbook for a logic class entitled The Logical Worldview, Skills to Distinguish Fact from Fiction in the Contemporary Information War. Students used the textbook in its preliminary edition for the first time last semester, and it will soon be in its first edition for a national launch. The textbook begins from the premise that we are in an information war in which sophisticated operations emerging from both governmental bodies and corporations are using information as a tool to reshape human psychology and ultimately behavior, not always in our best interests, of course. This textbook delves into both the history of logic as well as cutting-edge research, so as to aid students to remain rooted in logical thinking in the midst of the battle for their minds. The book includes detailed accounts of propaganda strategies, a comprehensive account of the varieties of fallacies, different accounts of the relationship between faith and reason, as well as historical portraits of the sophists and Aristotle's categories. The textbook presupposes that logic is like a fence guarding the soil of our understanding of physics, from which our character develops like a healthy plant. The textbook addresses both clarity and validity of thinking about individual arguments, as well as general presuppositions on major questions forming one's worldview. This is the first book of Daniel Dal Monte, and he is also the author of a work of speculative fiction entitled The Realm of Possibility. This book, his second book, begins with a terrible tragedy in which a man named Jim loses his daughter Ruth in a car accident, but the man accesses a technology whereby he's able to reverse engineer the past. Using this technology to restore a present in which his daughter continues to live, Jim has to deal with the complex consequences of making an adjustment in the interconnected web of events. I need them both like yesterday, Professor.
Yeah, absolutely.
At this point, I'd like to also welcome Chris.
Hi, everyone. Hello, Professor.
Hi, Chris. Nice to meet you.
Hi there. Likewise.
And moving on now to Dr. Dal Monte's PhD in philosophy from Temple University in Philadelphia. He wrote a dissertation under Professor Ostarik on using Kant's doctrine of transcendental idealism to develop a theoretical framework for a theory of free will, about which we're discussing tonight. In particular, the doctrine of transcendental idealism is effective in developing an agent causal account of freedom, as opposed to an event causal or a non-causal account of freedom. So these are the things Professor Dal Monte is going to explain to us in detail in a few while. So, Professor, why did you choose Kant as a dissertation first of all?
Well, I think Kant is obviously an extremely rich thinker, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, and really a shaper of our modern intellectual culture. So Kant is a seminal figure. You to really understand philosophy, modern philosophy, you must understand Kant. So I believe Kant is central. He's, maybe you don't agree with everything he says, but he argues very cogently, and just an extremely rich system that I found very engaging and stimulating, and so yes, an extremely brilliant and important thinker. Yeah.
Yes.
So Kant wrote at the time of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was a period in which, occurring in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Okay. So the Enlightenment, the German word is Aufklärung. Aufklärung is the German word for the Enlightenment. And Kant was working at this period, and he wrote an essay called "What is Enlightenment?" And he defined the Enlightenment as this emergence from a state of intellectual minority. So it is as though we were in a period prior to the Enlightenment of being a minor, of being like a child, being like prior to this age of maturity, insofar as a lot of the both political and religious approaches involved an appeal to authority. So people relied upon authority in their politics. This was prior to the spread of democracy, of events like the French Revolution. There was a monarchy. There was little political power for the ordinary person. And also in religion, there's a strong reliance on the church, on the authority of dogma, and surrendering your reason to a higher authority. Okay, but Kant is writing this period of ferment in which human beings are, through the power of science, realizing that they can think for themselves, that they can use the power of their reason to liberate themselves from higher political or religious authorities. So Kant's writing this period of great ferment, and there's a central tension that I want to highlight. The tension that arose in the Enlightenment is that the new sciences were developing an understanding of human nature as mechanistic. They were discovering that, well, maybe we can explain human behavior strictly in terms of natural causes. So you have the idea of man as a machine emerging. You can explain us in terms of external influences working through our physiology and issuing in our actions. So we're like a machine. We take in input and we produce output. So this is a new scientific paradigm for the human person.
Yes.
Now, the paradox, though, is that the Enlightenment is claiming that we're independent, we're autonomous. We are going to have political liberty, we're going to think for ourselves, okay? So there's this tension between what the new sciences are showing about human behavior as determined, as subject to natural law, okay? And then there's also this simultaneous call for liberation. There seems to be a paradox there, and Kant is stepping in, trying to both preserve the the integrity of the scientific enterprise, trying to find a rational order in nature, but also preserving a strong sense of freedom for the human individual. So this is essential to Kant's project of reconciling these two images of human beings that are in tension, this dissonance at the heart of the Enlightenment. A liberated, autonomous individual that is fighting back against authoritarian political and religious structures. And then the mechanistic human being that the new sciences are showing as someone that is as a being that's a product of its environment. Yeah, this tension is very central.
Yes, of course. How true. It also reminds us of the fact that he also tried to reconcile the theory of both rationalists like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, saying that the synthetic a priori knowledge of the world is a must, and also the theory of Hume, who was an empiricist of the time, who put emphasis on experience, actually, and also as a mediator, as a go-between his religious beliefs and also the intellectualism of his time.
Exactly. So you put it very well, Dimitrios. There are these opposing ideas.
Yeah.
That he tries to synthesize. So you have the rationalist, okay? The rationalist like Leibniz, okay? They're using pure reason, reason apart from experience, to try to discern the fundamental nature of reality, okay? So we see this originally in Plato, where the idea is to rise above the senses and to use your reason to discern what is ultimately real, okay? And so Leibniz had this elaborate system where he used rational principles to prove that God exists. So rational proof for God's existence. And to ultimately conclude that we're living in this best of all possible worlds. We're living in this world that God has chosen from all the possible worlds he could have chosen from. That is the best possible one. So with his reason, Leibniz has deduced that this is the best of all possible worlds. So on the one hand, we have this rationalist system that is very ambitious. It has this very broad and profound conclusion that we're in the best of all possible worlds. On the other hand, you have an empiricist like Hume, okay? And Hume is saying that all these ideas we get from metaphysics, ideas like substance, okay, this goes back to Aristotle, ousia, the substance, the underlying unity of properties. Okay, you have ousia, substance. You have causation. A and B are related causally. Okay, Hume looks at this and says, well, all these ideas have no basis in experience. He has something called the copy principle. Our ideas are a copy of some impression that we have received. And any idea that surpasses a basis in impressions is just nonsense. It has no concrete meaning. And so Hume is seeking to eviscerate all these metaphysical excesses that we find in people like Leibniz. So you have these opposing camps, the rationalist with their ambitious a priori, it's a Latin phrase, a priori, meaning prior to experience. And then the empiricists, who are a posteriori, they're basing their ideas on experience. They're giving us these radically different ways of knowing, and then these radically different ideas of what reality is. Kant is coming in to try to reconcile them, to synthesize them, exactly. So I don't know if you want me to go on there, or do you want to jump in? Either.
Chris, you would like to jump in?
Well, we've just got up to more or less talking about the context in which Kant in particular was operating, and how perhaps he was either consciously or unconsciously bridging these two competing approaches to philosophical discourse, or perhaps taking the best or some of both of them forward to something else. I think a quick side point on Kant, before we get into the detail of the free will stuff, which is very interesting for everybody, and it's a universal subject of philosophy, I guess, from history, and that it's, I think, generally acknowledged that Kant is, by comparison to perhaps 98% of other philosophers, extremely dense, obscure, and difficult to read. So when you say that in order to understand philosophy, you have to understand Kant, it might sound to some people like saying, in order to understand mathematics, you need to understand quantum physics or something, or some kind of similar analogy. Let's assume that you're right without getting into an argument about this. How would you recommend people get into Kant, given that we're obviously receiving it in translation? So it's often like a very technical approach to philosophy that we're receiving in translated form. What's your recommendation for people who want to get into it and want to get a feel for Kant, or perhaps the most accessible way into understanding his philosophy?
Well, I will say that Kant is more accessible than other major figures like Hegel, right, or Heidegger. So I think Kant is more straightforward and accessible than other German figures. And we do have a disadvantage that we're getting translations. So if we don't know the original German, then we are at a disadvantage. So how would we go about approaching such a difficult work? It is quite difficult, but I would begin with just some encyclopedia articles. So there's two great philosophical encyclopedias that are online and free. So there is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, so you go on there, you'll find lots of information about Kant, written in contemporary English. Okay, and then perhaps even more accessible, I think, is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So simply go online to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is written by scholars, so it is trustworthy. And you can type in Immanuel Kant and read through that. You'll get a basis, you'll get a framework. I would go on YouTube, look up some lectures, and then none of this is a substitute for reading the primary text. Eventually, work through the primary text. Take it bit by bit, and maybe find a commentary, a good commentary. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there are maybe like commentaries where you have the primary text and then you have a commentary. So Yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Thanks for that. Very useful tips. And we can also do a separate, what would you call it, league table or hierarchy of complicated German philosophers, and do a score against each of them, and see if we agree on who is the most unreadable. But it won't be Nietzsche, I suppose. That'll be the only point of agreement. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Demetrius, back to you.
Yeah. Assuming the fact that Kant's theory on transcendental idealism takes as a starting point the fact that the objects are revolving around human's mind and not vice versa. We are sure of the fact that Kant gives a lot of emphasis on the way human mind works and the steps that the human mind's rationality the steps of the human mind are very important, so that human beings come to a great deal of understanding of how the universe works. So what exactly are the laws of this understanding of human mind? And this term called synthetic a priori concepts that are formulated within the human mind.
Very good, very good. So you mentioned this turn. There's a turn in Kant.
Yeah.
That he calls the Copernican revolution.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So Copernicus, as many people may know, moved towards a heliocentric idea of the universe, as opposed to a geocentric.
Yeah.
So he thought that we could explain phenomena in a much more unified and consistent way by positing that the sun is the center of the not the universe, but the solar system. It's now the solar system because the sun is the center of it, as opposed to the earth.
Yeah.
So he changed the whole model. He changed the whole paradigm of science. Well, Kant wants to do the same thing with the mind.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay?
Exactly.
He is saying that objects do not determine the mind. Let's fundamentally reframe this. The structures of the mind determine the objects. Okay, so this is the paradigm shift that Kant introduces. And what is the fundamental motivation? Well, it's because of Hume. Hume is in the background, who's a very clear writer. A very clear. Go back to Chris's point. Hume is crystal clear. Hume is a huge threat. Kant says that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. He was in this dogmatic slumber where he had all these beliefs and he thought he could know reality through his reason. But Hume showed, no, you have no basis for these ideas. So Kant said, let's try a new way. Let's shift the structure of objects to the mind. And so Kant says that the mind has all these a priori, again, meaning before, just it's a Latin phrase, just means before you encounter the object, you bring with it all these structures of experience. They're called transcendental structures. Okay, they're conditions of experience. To have experience, for instance, you have to have a single self-consciousness. Okay, we are uniting our experience in one self-consciousness. Otherwise, we would have like these fragments that are disconnected. So when I experience this conversation, I'm experiencing it as me in a continuous way. This is a condition of experience. So Kant identifies space and time as conditions, a priori conditions. They are ideal. They are part of the mind. They're not part of reality in itself. So space and time are part of the mind. And then also the categories. He takes Aristotle's categories, he modifies them. For Kant, there are 12. For Aristotle, there are 10. He takes them, they're categories now of the mind. They're structures of judgment. They're not structures of reality in itself. Okay? So what you have in Kant then is this distinction between appearances, what we experience, and then things in themselves. Ding an sich in German, the thing in itself. And so you have what we can experience, which our mind mediates. It's in space and time. It has a location, it has a time. It has a judgmental structure of substance, of modality, of quality, of quantity. These are the categories of the understanding. And this is the appearance of a thing. But then there's this deeper level of reality, which is totally unknown. It is independent of the mind. It is in this, what he calls the noumenal domain, from the Greek word nous, meaning that we can only think about it with our minds. We can't experience it. And of this domain, of the noumenal domain, we can have no knowledge. So in some ways, Kant saves metaphysics by giving it a place as a foundation of experience. But in another way, some of his critics have said, well, you're cutting this off from reality. We can never access reality as it is in itself. And so there's this depth to reality that we'll never know. And it creates this sense, this agonizing separation that we always aspire to, but we can never get clarity. So Kant begins his preface with this beautiful phrase that reason has questions that it can't escape, but it can never resolve. So
yeah, how true. And nevertheless, there are some academics that say that even though Kant claims that we cannot know that God either exists or does not exist, even though we don't know for sure what exists beyond space and time, they think that we should believe the theory of transcendentalism because it is still useful to our everyday lives, to our inquiry, to our way, to our attempt to appreciate aesthetic life more richly and to create a morally satisfying universe. So it seems as if Kant makes a leap into a universal moral code, which could apply not only to individuals, but also to nations and eventually to the whole universe.
Yes, very good point. So yeah, so Kant is famous for this phrase. There were two things that created awe for Kant. Okay, this is a key idea. The starry heavens above and the moral law within. These are the two sources of awe for Kant. Okay, so it is the world of nature and then the moral law within. Now, this is the key. And this is what I said before about the Enlightenment. Okay, the world of nature is completely deterministic. Okay, so the world of nature for Kant is subject to laws. It follows a lawful order. Okay, so this is the appreciation of science. We have a science because we can express mathematically the relationships in the natural world. This is very important. As you said, it's very crucial to our lives. We can understand the natural world, we can manipulate it, we can master it. And this is a product of the Enlightenment. Okay, the world is intelligible. It follows laws. We can understand it and we can master it and make our lives better. Okay. At the same time, we have within us a moral law coming from our conscience, demanding that we adopt principles that everybody else can share. This is the idea of Kant's categorical imperative. The idea that you can only act on principles or maxims that everyone else can have too. So you shouldn't be having a principle that you wouldn't want someone else to have. So when we do something wrong, we have these principles that we only allow ourselves to have. So if I steal something, I wouldn't permit someone else to have that same principle towards me. So kind of saying we have this moral law. And so to follow the moral law, though, Kant thinks you must have freedom. Okay? You can't follow an ought. You can't do what you ought to do if you're just a machine. So if you're just a machine, you're going to do whatever your environment has shaped you to do. Okay? So this is where this doctrine of transcendental idealism becomes very useful, right? Because we as human beings are occupying both worlds. We're in appearances. Okay, so our bodies are part of the world of the appearances. And that means that we are subject to the laws of nature. We are also scientific phenomenon. All right, science, psychology, neurochemistry, which Kant didn't know about, but we do now. We can study ourselves scientifically. Okay, but Kant thinks we occupy both worlds. So deep within ourselves, we also occupy the noumenal world. The noumenal world, which is independent of science. And so that's where our free will can come in our, what Kant calls the intelligible character, what is independent of science. So we can be both free and determined because we occupy these two worlds.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a really excellent summary of where we start with the question or challenge of free will and morality with Kant, which is, as you said, the categorical imperative, a very clear and one of those rules that's easier to apply than many philosophical maxims. And at the same time, as I'm sure you know, there are many challenges to free will as a concept, to non-determinist free will, let's say, and to compatibilism, and indeed to other aspects of Kant, and I think these are very interesting. We should perhaps try and schedule another discussion about those because we're coming to the end of our meeting time now. So thank you very much, Professor. Where can people find you and your work? We heard Demetrius talking about your book. Do you have social media or particular pages that you encourage people to come and check you out and to engage with you in discussions like this, or at least see the kind of things you're doing? Where should people check you out?
Yes, in fact, I have a Substack, a Substack where I write periodically. It's called Philosophy and Culture. So you can just type in Daniel Dal Monte, my name, at Substack in your search engine, and it should pop up. So I'd love to have people follow me there.